Okay, welcome everybody to the second CIRC seminar of the semester. I'd like to begin with an advertisement for our next seminar, which is on the 23rd by Dr. Bryce Beamer of the SSRC Trans-Regional Research Organization, where he's a fellow. He's talking about how do we compare global slaveries, war captives, and cultural exchange in Southeast Asia. Controversial, fascinating topic. And we also have a seminar coming up on Myanmar.
Yes.
On a Tuesday.
The 31st, I think?
The 31st.
It will be Halloween?
Is it Halloween?
I think it's Halloween, 31st.
I hadn't thought of that. If you're superstitious, don't worry, it's fine.
We have to dress up.
You could. Although the topic is the Rohingya crisis, so maybe it's not appropriate. But anyway, there'll be information about the CIRC on the CIRC website about that. Anyway, today I'm very pleased to welcome one of our own, a recent acquisition, to use football terminology. Somebody who kindly accepted our offer to come and work at CityU. Danny Marks is assistant professor in the Department of Asian International Studies and of course now a core member of CIRC. For those of you who don't know Danny, who's been with us now for several weeks, he is a specialist on environmental studies, and that's an essential part of the department's work, and will also be a key issue which he's addressing today in his talk. Before coming to CityU, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. He spent a number of years researching and living in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand and Bangkok, where he's worked on fields of climate change, adaptation, and environmental governance. He finished his PhD dissertation on urban political ecology of the Bangkok floods, which we'll be talking about today, at the University of Sydney. He also is interested in issues of disaster government, climate justice, and Thai domestic politics. Danny, thanks for volunteering. Thanks for your willingness to share your research, and we look forward to your talk today.
Thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction, and thank you, CIRC, for organizing this. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. So I think, as most of you know, in 2011, Thailand had its worst floods ever in terms of losses and damage. About 800 people died, $45 billion in damage. It still ranks as one of the top 10 disasters globally. And most of the damage occurred within the Bangkok area and the surrounding regions. In response to the floods, the Thai government leaders at the time blamed it only on climate change and nature. For example, Deputy Prime Minister Kitirat Naranong said the flooding, quote, has been the result of climate change and global warming. Ex-Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra says, it seems like we're fighting against the forces of nature. Their explanation follows the dominant approach to disasters as natural or climate-induced. In contrast, I will show today how the floods are also socially and politically produced. They were the outcome of political decisions, economic interests, and power relations. I'll also show how vulnerability was uneven at multiple scales across the social and geographic landscapes. So to do this, I will first summarize my approach to the floods. So I will look at how actions prior to 2011 created conditions of the floods, but also uneven vulnerability to the floods. I also talk about how actions in 2011, both at the scale of the Tapia Basin, but also within Bangkok, affected vulnerability. And finally, I'll ask whether the responses after 2011, how they've affected vulnerability to future flooding. So the dominant approach to flooding seeks to manage excessive rainfall. And so basically vulnerability is seen as exposure to floods. So victims happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Engineering is seen as a panacea. So engineers devise technological solutions to prevent floodwater from reaching populations, buildings, and key infrastructure. So this is seen as the technological fix. And it's the dominant approach globally, particularly in cities in the global south. But social scientists have critiqued this approach for a number of reasons. There's increased losses when infrastructures fail. So you saw this during Hurricane Katrina. So when populations are not prepared, but also there's not land use planning, so there's nowhere for the water to go. but also the scant consideration of equality. So those outside the flood walls, for example, can be flooded worse. Finally, a disregard of social environmental processes, which make some groups more vulnerable than others. So I reject this approach, and I draw upon urban political ecology, which views cities as hybrids and historical products of human-nature interactions. They reject the separation of nature and cities, saying that humans have transformed nature in cities. They also view cities as landscapes of power, drawing upon the work of David Harvey, which raises the question of how power determines who gains access to resources in the city, such as why some urban communities are located where they are. So when you're thinking about flooding, spaces of vulnerability and exposure to hazards are uneven. The less powerful often lie in low-lying areas or those close to rivers. They can't afford to live in other areas. Also, those that are best protected to hazards, such as those living in areas protected by dikes or in higher land, are normally the elite and the powerful. And so the state is the crucial actor because this is the one who normally invests in flood risk reduction, in flood walls and tunnels, but also land use planning. So in many countries today, the elite have been able to use the state to protect themselves at the expense of others. So one last point, social scientists reject the word natural disasters. All disasters, when humans come in contact with them, are seen as unnatural. So they're not as act of gods, but a result of human nature interactions. So they occur not only because of heavy rainfalls, but also because of environmental unsustainable development projects over time. So where floods occur, who they affect, and their magnitude are a result of political and socioeconomic processes. And so these photos are from Hurricane Katrina, where you could see a lot of these different factors coming into play. The other body of work that I draw upon in my research is environmental justice, which started in the 1980s in the U.S. According to Hillman, it's quote, as a research program originated amidst concerns of the unjust distribution of environmental hazards, primarily in close to disadvantaged or marginalized communities. So it started in North Carolina in the 1980s, where the government was decided to build a waste site, which had a lot of chemicals close to a black community. And there were protests at the time. And so continually, this has become a research program as well, looking at the location of toxic waste sites, dumps, and power plants, and also looking at the factors of power and environmental risk, and also looking at poverty and race. And so David Schlossberg, an environmental theorist at the University of Sydney, has said there's 3 types of environmental injustices. One is distribution, one is procedure, and the last is recognition. So when you think about flooding, for example, for distribution, it would be one half the room got the flood water, the other half didn't, and the government diverted water to that side. That would be unfair in terms of distribution. In terms of procedure, with this half of the room, were they asked about the decision in terms of diversion of flood water? And finally, recognition. So for this group might be seen ethnic minority or a different race, and so they're not fully recognized as citizens often. And so further, environmental goods and harms tend to follow that of economic goods and harms, particularly within cities. So environmental justice traces patterns of development and decision making and how these produce injustices. Finally, Pavol and Adger add that just responses to environmental risks should prioritize the most vulnerable, which are often the poor and groups and minorities. So recently, scholars have used this framework to analyze disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, emphasizing unequal risks as questions of justice, but it hasn't been widely done in Asia, particularly in terms of disaster. So I draw upon this framework also in my analysis. So I think also before turning to the floods, it's important to think about Thailand's socioeconomic status and inequality within the country. So Thailand is highly unequal. It's been ranked 6th globally in terms of income inequality. Recently, Credit Suisse last year came up with a ranking of wealth inequality, and Thailand ranked 3rd after India and Brazil. So half of all investments and rents are captured by the top 1%. And so these inequalities have bred privileged access to power and justice. and so is Pasuk Pongbaishit and Chris Baker have termed it's an oligarchy. The powerful have never been conclusively undermined or strongly challenged. Thailand used to be used to have a legal caste system, and so each person was given a certain number of points. And this has turned into an oligarchy, and so the powerful have actually undermined redistributive policies. This inequalities are particularly stark in Bangkok, but this inequality has also led to growing discontent among the masses with the system. They're less willing to accept traditional social hierarchy and the high degree of inequalities. This particularly started in the 1970s, in 1973 and 1976, when you have massive protests. And as Benedict Anderson wrote, many young Thais came openly to question certain central elements of the old hegemonic culture. And this continued in the 80s and 90s, and particularly in the last 10 years, with the red shirt protests at the grassroots levels, who successfully organized sustained resistance and raised doubts about the fairness of traditional Thai society. So there's been increasing friction between the elite and the masses. And this came to bear, as I'll show, during the 2011 floods. But also the elite continue to uphold traditional views. They think what's best for them is best for the country. And so I want to look at how this inequality affected responsive governance of floods. So my study is the first that looked at this. And then finally, I think it's important to think about the Thai state. The political economy are the structure of the Thai state. So Craig Reynolds at Australian National University came up with this. Came up with this diagram, and so these are different nodes of power within Thailand. So power is not seen like a CEO structure with the CEO at the top and the pyramid below him or her, but instead it's more lumped among these different aggregates and nodes of power. So, for example, here you would have the palace and the different factions within the palace, the army, parliament. And so they seek to maintain their own autonomy and distinct authority. Further, the different ministries within Thailand, they operate as small kingdoms. They want to control projects under the jurisdiction. So this fragmentation has caused conflicts of interest between ministries and departments and interagency clashes, as happened during the floods. And furthermore, there are a number of veto players which have thwarted public goods in this sector, such as flood prevention measures and improved water management. So they bestowed favor to their clients. So it's important, I think, to think about this political economy when looking at what happened during 2011, but also in the history of urbanization and water management within Thailand. So now to move to my study. So this is based off of my PhD research. I spent 16 months conducting fieldwork in Thailand. I did a two-tiered methodology. So one was I conducted field work in 4 different communities that were flooded along the outskirts of Bangkok. And then second, I conducted almost 100 interviews of different key actors, ranging from a former prime minister to deputy prime ministers to Bangkok Metropolitan Administration officials to local community leaders, and looked at how their actions and the discourses they promoted were produced or silenced, and how they affected vulnerability within these 4 communities. So this is a map of the 4 different communities. So when I talk about Bangkok, I think it's important to remember I'm not talking only about the Bangkok metropolitan area, because these 3 areas were badly flooded, but also these areas are also highly urbanized, and many people in these areas work in Bangkok and they reside in these provinces. So I conducted research in Don Mueang. Many of you might have been there. This is the site of the old airport, but then it reopened as a low-budget airport. One is a slum community named Prom Samrit. The other is a lower middle income housing community named Yucharon. And then finally, I conducted research in Phuket Patana, which is a slum community. It resides right on the border between Pathum Thani and Bangkok. So on the other side of the canal is Bangkok. And then finally, the 4th one is Bang Bua Thong Market, which is a traditional market in Nonthaburi province. So all right. So now to go to the history of Bangkok and how it affected vulnerability to flooding. So Bangkok was founded in 1782. Its space and topography has always made it vulnerable to flooding. As you can see right here, it's very low lying. This is the elevation of the Tapia River Basin. So Bangkok's right here at the bottom. There's 4 different rivers, the Pingwan, Nan, and Yom River. They meet right here in the Khon Sawan to form the Tapia River, and they flow down through Bangkok and empty into the Gulf of Thailand. But Bangkok at first was a water-based city, and it was called by an Italian diplomat in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, as the Venice of the East. And so it had amphibious dwellings. People lived along the river, and raised houses. Also lived in boats, and boats served as the main form of transportation. And rice paddies around the city served as drainage areas. So you could say the city had a high resilience to flooding at the time. In the 1890s, this started to change. Roads soon replaced canals, and land-based houses replaced amphibian dwellings. And the metropolitan area ballooned specifically after World War II, particularly after World War II. So from 51 square kilometers in the 1950s to 551 square kilometers by 2005. And it grew in an outward fashion, ribbon-like fashion, along 3 major transportation routes. So today it is still one of the biggest primate cities in the world. So if you look at primacy, you measure the comparison of the biggest city in a country to the second biggest city. And so Bangkok right now is 33 times larger than the second city, which is the city of Nonthaburi, which is in the Bangkok metropolitan region to begin with. In 1980, it was 51 times larger than Chiang Mai. So this is partly due to government policy, which prioritized the growth of Bangkok to the neglect of the rest of Thailand. This is through infrastructure investment. Built a number of roads, built the seaport, the airport, promoting manufacturing activity, and the relative neglect of the agriculture sector. There's a repressive rice tax. And so according to 2012 statistics, this is the year after the floods, 72% of public funding from the national level was spent in Greater Bangkok, but only 17% of Thais live there. So also this was done by commercial banks and finance companies, which bet on winners and encouraged Bangkok-centric large-scale industry growth. So most of the major industries and manufacturing were first in Bangkok, and they spread out to the provinces around Bangkok. So, for example, 90% of industrial credits in the 1980s were offered by banks to Bangkok-based enterprises. While the Board of Investment offered tax breaks to encourage investment in an outlying region, there wasn't enough incentive. And so the area continued to expand between the 70s and the 90s particularly. So many of the industrial estates were an hour or 2 north of Don Mueang Airport. So you had major companies like Nikon, Honda, Canon. So the Japanese invested particularly after the Plaza Accords in the mid-80s. And so for example, in 1978, the BMR, which is Bangkok province, plus the 5 surrounding provinces, accounted for 52% of the country's whole GDP. So this led to massive outward expansion, massive land use change. So this shows between 1953 the shape of the city. This is the built-up area. So in 1974, it's like this. This is the ribbons, so the east, west, and the north were the ribbons that the city expanded upon. And as you can see, it's not very planned at all. There's no blocks. It's not very neatly planned. It's just kind of a blob with different. And there's also still spaces of not built-up area between the built-up area. So this graph shows the change in urban built-up area between 1988 and 2003. And so in Bangkok, it was 38%, but the fastest was in the the other provinces. So Pathum Thani was 112%, Nakhon Pathom was 640%. And so this concretization, though, made it worse for flooding. So on land with natural ground cover, 50% of precipitation can infiltrate into the ground, whereas the land that is impervious, only 15%. So this hastens water into the waterways. But a second problem was also that the city, so the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration had designated the western and eastern parts of Bangkok to be a floodway. So I don't think you can see this really well with the light. But this is the eastern zone and the western zone, and this photo, which you can't see at all, but it shows a number of houses had been constructed in the eastern floodway. So maybe a little better, but you can try anyway. A team of researchers counted the number of houses. So this made it very bad because when you had flooding, this area was supposed to be left undeveloped, but the houses blocked the water, and they were also badly damaged. So as I mentioned, so there's mass concretization throughout the Bangkok metropolitan region, and so that hastens water into the waterways. But another major problem was many of the canals, which had made Bangkok the Venice of the East, had been filled in. So a law the government had enacted was that if you buy the land and there's a canal on that land, you can fill it in. So this statistics that a team of researchers found that of the canals that had been filled in, 97% were in private land. Of those covered, 79% were in private land. And so those that were normal the majority were in public land. And so this also meant there was less room for water to go. And then finally, there's been a widespread land subsidence. Starting since the 1970s, the city has sunk by over 1 meter. This is continuing today, but not as fast a pace as it used to be. This is due primarily to excessive groundwater pumping, particularly by industries. This only started to go down in 2006 when the government implemented a heavy tax on pumping. The Federation of Thai Industries that actually pushed back against that tax. So as a result, this has sunk the level of the ground progressively. And this means that this is worse for flooding because one, the level of dikes sink, but second, it takes longer for water to drain out. And then related to that, one other problem is that there's been uncoordinated city planning. So a real estate developer gave me these different maps of the different city plans. So so right over here is Bangkok. This is Nonthaburi right here, Pathum Thani. And I circled this area because, as I mentioned, that BMA had designated this area to be a floodway. And so water would come from the north, and it could be stored right here. But the Nonthaburi government didn't consult the Bangkok government, and so they changed this to a yellow area, which means there can be a built-up area. So Bong Bua Tong, where I did research, is right there. And so that meant that this area, the gray area, for example, could only catch rainwater. It couldn't hold any floodwater. So, and then finally, there's problems with the city's flood management. There's an over-reliance on infrastructure. So they built the King's Dyke right here to protect the city from flooding after there had been a number of smaller floods in the past 20 years. But it wasn't built high enough. It was breached in a number of places. Also infrastructure, the number of water pumps are particularly in the center of Bangkok. And so the center of Bangkok is the best protected. But the other issue is infrastructure did not keep up with development. So there's a lot of development outside the King's Dyke. And so as I'll show, those areas where the forest flooded. So there was inequalities in terms of exposure. And another key issue, though, is development was highly unequal within Bangkok. The most powerful often live in the inner city or on higher land, while the poorest often live in low-lying land, often next to canals. So this is a graph that shows a representation of a typical slum community in Bangkok. They live encroaching right along the canal because this land is the only land that is public land, and so it's owned by the Royal Irrigation Department, and so it was free for them to reside there. And they couldn't afford to live in other areas. There's very little public housing, or the public housing was quite far from factories, where many of them worked. And so, in contrast, the housing estates, which were nearby, land under them were filled. Real estate developers filled them. And so as a result, slum communities were most exposed to the overflowing of canals. So rain from from these housing communities would flow to the slum communities in the canals. And then also, these slum communities have always been neglected by the national and Bangkok government. So there's been a decline in minimum wage in real terms for 20 plus years until Yingluck raised it a few years after the floods. There's been a redistributive tax policy. They restricted unions. There's been limited access to credits. Another key, so this is a representation of a flood. This is a Prom Sum Rit community where I conducted field work. You can see the canal right here, and you can see how far they're encroaching upon the canal. And you can see how narrow the walkway is, and under this is often stagnant water and trash. And then this also shows the difference in land elevation in Bangkok, Noi and Rong Sit, which are two suburban areas. So SH stands for slum house, and TH stands for townhouse. And so you can see the elevation is much lower of the slum house than the townhouses. This is another study done. And then one final factor that also affected uneven vulnerability is that in the 1980s, as land prices rose, some communities were evicted in the center of Bangkok to make way for shopping malls, offices. And so where they moved were on the outskirts of Bangkok or on the peripheral areas, because this is where land was cheaper, but also where the factories were built. And so I created this map looking at the number of slums. And so Don Mueang, where I conducted field work, is one of the areas with the most number of slums, while the inner city of Bangkok has the fewest number of slums. And these are the areas that were flooded the worst, as I'll show. So looking at the political economy of Bangkok's urbanization, as Jim Glassman of the University of British Columbia said that the elite had no specific reason to be concerned with broad-based or egalitarian development in Thailand per se, and has systematically encouraged Bangkok-centric growth. And the urbanization of Bangkok has always been elite-driven. In the early period, the monarchy, nobles, and the wealthy instigated the city's transformation from a water-based to land-based economy. So they invested in roads, they invested in housing, and they profited from the city's transformation. They could collect rents, speculate on land, and connect the city to new economic areas. After World War II, the leaders of the bureaucratic polity enacted policies to support industrial growth. So the bureaucratic polity was seen as the military, the bureaucrats, and the monarchy. And most of the investment was in Bangkok or surrounding areas. So Field Marshal Sarit Tanarat said, let the private sector handle more business activities than the government. They were unelected, so to gain popular support, they wanted to encourage foreign investment and rapid growth. In the second half of the 70s, as the country democratized, as there was rapid growth in the 70s and 80s, there was a change in the country's political economy. So there's increased opportunities to accumulate wealth, and this led to the rise of local elite and the middle class, particularly in Bangkok. And so they also pushed for deregulation, particularly of environmental regulations and land use planning as well. So this has led to environmental problems and heightened vulnerability. At the same time, the urban poor were marginalized. They were the ones that were left behind and did not profit as much from Bangkok's rapid urbanization. So now moving from Bangkok to the wider Tapia River Basin. So as I talked about before, there's 4 different rivers. This is the Tapia River Basin that meet in the Khon Sawan to form the Tapia River and go to Bangkok. So until the end of the 19th century, state control in the basin over water management was mostly absent. Good weather resulted in good crops, and bad weather resulted in bad crops. There was no irrigation or drainage systems, so most of the lower part of the delta was unpopulated marshland. People only settled along the banks. It was difficult for humans to settle anywhere else. In the last few decades of the century, the government and the Siam Lands Canal and Irrigation Company built a number of canals for agricultural expansion. And in the first half of the 20th century, there was a number of minor projects. But starting in the 1950s, so this map shows some of the canals that were in Bangkok. This is the wrong canal map area. In the 1950s, this all started to change. So the government, funded by the World Bank and USAID, built a number of dams, large-scale dams in the north and northeast. So this is the Chhalpria, Bhumibol, and Sirikit Dam, and they were multifunctional. So they were to provide store water for irrigation and also hydropower, electricity generation, but also retain water for flood control. But the multiple purposes of the dams can backfire, as what happened in 2011. The RID also built a number of canals and dikes along the canals for irrigation. So by 2006, all the Tapia River Basin had been brought under control. They could control water in this area, and farmers could now grow 2 crops per year. This also enabled farmers to change from using a labor-intensive floating rice variety to a short stem variety. This is a shorter harvesting time and did not require nearly as much manual labor. But the problem with this rice variety is not resistant to flooding. It can only stand floodwater for a short time, or it wouldn't grow. The main drivers of this change of the control over the Tapia River Basin was the Royal Irrigation Department, which fueled continuous infrastructure construction. So and they were successful in terms of enabling the transformation from a marshy lowlands and the lower delta into productive paddy fields. So the area of paddy cultivation expanded almost threefold, from 35 million rye in the 1950s to 59 million rye in the 1980s. This also enabled urbanization in central Thailand, so governments could build roads and later developers could build housing estates, shopping malls, and office. But this also increased the risk of flooding. So these are the 2 major dams, Bhumibol and Sirikit Dam, which I'll talk about later. And then the Chhalpria Dam was also a major dam that was built. And then this is a smaller one. And then this is Bangkok, right down here. But the problem was the system was designed for irrigation, not for flooding. So irrigation canals are built like a funnel. They're narrow at the top, they're wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. But flooding canals should be the opposite, narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. And as the Royal Irrigation RID officer told me, the whole system is not constructed for storage. There are no reservoirs. Also, local governments built a number of dikes upstream along the Chhalpia rivers ad hoc. There was no coordination. But this meant that water would flow faster downstream. There was less room for the water. And there was also no land use planning in central Thailand. So this led to loss of wetlands. And also the construction of industrial estates in the Utia, which is where the Japanese built a lot of estates, reduced the area's drainage capacity. The other problem is not only the hardware, is also the software was not designed for flooding. So RID's mandate is to provide water for irrigation. There's no agency in Thailand which has a sole mandate to manage flooding. And it's highly fragmented. 30 agencies are involved in water resource development. So departments are like, as Nippon said, departments are like a horse. They look only straight ahead. So information is scattered and not collaborated together. And so each agency had its own data collection system. So overall, the basin's infrastructure institutional configuration was not designed to cope with high-level flooding. So this meant that it would not require a lot of water necessarily to raise the risk of flooding, of serious flooding. And so this is just a map of the roads that were built. Okay, so now to move to 2011, I'll probably have to skip some sections, so first of all, looking at how much rain was there actually. If there was a lot of rain, then Yingluck and her cabinet leaders would be right in saying that it was nature and climate change. Also, the World Bank, JICA, they said it was a 1 in 100 year flood, which basically means after every 100 years you'd only get this much rain. And that would also lead credence to that argument. But a team of meteorologists two different teams of meteorologists who did not work together independently found that no, this is not the case. So one team called Gale and Sanders found that of the 10 largest flood events, in terms of magnitude, this is only the 5th largest. You can see right here, this is the 5th largest. But the duration was the longest, but the area affected was also much smaller. And I would argue that was because of politics. So they estimate at most a 20 to 30 year return period for the flood. The other team of meteorologists also looked at climate change, and they found that climate change did not play a major role in this flood, but it could in future floods. So if there wasn't that much water, what was the problem? So there was a number of storms that hit northern Thailand right here in August and September, and so there was low medium level flooding up here, and so as the water descended into the Tapia Dam, what happened was the ex-Prime Minister Banharn, who is a local godfather, he just passed away last year. He's the godfather of Suphanburi province. Suphanburi province is even known as Banharnburi. It badly flooded in the 90s, and so he made a promise that there would not be flooding again at Suphanburi. So what he did was, because there had been a recent election, and Yingluck had just won, his party allied with Yingluck, and he was granted the agriculture ministry portfolio. And so his good buddy Tira Wongsamut was the agriculture minister. So he just basically told Tira, all right, you're not going to open the water gates to Suphanburi. So as you can see right here, the water went east, not west. So Suphanburi was not flooded much at all. So here's the statistic. So Suphanburi has 500,000 rai of farmland. Only 64,000 rai was flooded out of a total of almost 1 million in the country. So as a result, but also it wasn't only Banharn, it was also Puatai, who had just been elected. One of their main constituents is farmers. And so they had promised farmers they would be given enough time to grow a second crop of rice. So in order to do so, they also did not open the water gates fully. This is the Bangshom Shi water gate. So this basically just shows that Banharn did not fully open the water gate to the west. So this is the eastern water gate. And the crucial months of flooding was fully open, but in the western part, it was not fully open until October. So this meant a lot more water flowed downstream. This is the first dike that was breached. 17 other dikes were breached downstream. And so by October, the dams, the Bhumibol and Syndicate dams are also filling up. And so they had to release water then. This added 17% more water. But they could have actually released the water earlier from the dams. And once again, this is a political decision. So I interviewed the dam manager, and he said he wanted to release water during this period in August and September when it hadn't reached the dam's rule curve. But he was overruled by Puatai because they wanted to give farmers enough time to grow the second crop of rice. So unfortunately, they did in October, where there was already bad flooding. So this is very inopportune and worsened the flooding downstream. So then the water, just to go back again, the water flowed down. This is water flowed down to Ayutthaya, and then it hit Bangkok. So as water reached Bangkok, there was uneven vulnerability along 3 different scalar levels. The first was between provinces. So the Bangkok government sought to prevent water from entering Bangkok at all costs. They wanted to keep Bangkok completely dry. So those outside, the other provinces, were flooded worse. As one person I interviewed said, it was not fair. Some areas were blocked by big bags, and the other side of the canal was dry and people could still walk normally. BMA, which is Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, should have let the water go through the whole area. So many were angry at the Bangkok governor, Sukhumban, who closed water gates and built flood walls along the northern, eastern, and western parts of Bangkok. So they also blamed it on politics, because Sukhumban is from the Democrat Party, and Yingluck is from the opposition party, Puatai. So one person said, the Democrat Party blocked the water to cause trouble to Prime Minister Yingluck. So Kukot Patana, which is one of the communities, they suffered high losses, 72,000 baht on average, versus their average monthly income of 20,000 baht. They only received 25,000 baht maximum in compensation. And so the community on the other side was flooded less. And so this is a map of the flooding in 2011. Unfortunately, it doesn't show elevation, but you can see that Pathum Thani was almost basically fully flooded. Nonthaburi was fully flooded, but Bangkok, especially the center, was dry. And so, but if you had elevation, it would also show this. The elevation was up to 2 meters in these areas. And this is the community. This is the canal along which they live, and this is the other community where there was much less flooding. So the second level of vulnerability was between districts. So once water entered Bangkok, the city, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, and the national government, to a lesser extent, sought to keep the inner city industrial estates as dry as possible. They didn't want to lose face. They wanted to keep the palace, the shopping malls, dry. So they constructed big sandbag walls in northern Bangkok, and they partitioned spaces of sacrifice and protection. But this created a deep sense of injustice. So in one of the communities where there's a sandbag wall right below them, 76% of the people I interviewed said it was unfair. So as one person said, the government unfairly divided people. People in the inner city are big people and big rich companies, but they did not protect the small people. So in Ucharon, 2 people died. One man lived by himself, and he slipped in the water and fainted and drowned. Another man became bankrupt. And so there was also in terms of high degree of uneven vulnerability in terms of the center versus the periphery. In particularly, the urban. The third level of uneven vulnerability is between communities. Some communities were flooded worse because of their location. 89% are located below the road, but also there was unemployment, theft. They also have fewer assets. And so overall, the urban poor were disproportionately affected. So a study by the UN found that of 20% living in Bangkok, which were affected, this is much higher in the surrounding provinces, 73 of them were low-income residents. So I'll skip this. This is looking at flood injustices. This is one of the recent papers I just submitted. But also governance, poor governance was a main issue, conflict between the BMA and national governments. They gave different warnings. The national government also said ALU, which means we can handle it. So people did not evacuate and move their stuff as quickly as they would have if the government had given a proper warning. Many people questioned the decision, many people I interviewed questioned the decision to keep the inner city completely dry. Well, they agreed that the inner city should not be badly flooded, at least maybe ankle level or knee level. And there's different things the government could have done instead of put sandbag walls, which slowed down the drainage and also created very, very high levels of water and stagnation for those outside. And finally, in November, Prime Minister Yingluck declared success, even though there was bad flooding in the outskirts still, because she knew at that point that the inner city would not be flooded. And so people were angry at that. So I'm running out of time, so I'll go over this quickly, but there was a lot of protests during the floods in some of the communities where I interviewed people. There was 85 protests overall in the Bangkok metropolitan region. They protested against the placement and height of sandbag walls, the height of the water gates and compensation schemes. They're often led by community leaders. I interviewed some of these people. So for example, in Ucharon, which was above one of the big sandbag walls, their slogan was, "We are quality citizens of Bangkok too." And so this is just a photo of the community leader on top of the bag. This is them doing a symbolic vote, saying whether they want the sandbag wall or not. And this is them negotiating with one of the government leaders. And they didn't tell him, but they actually got the TV station to come, and he agreed, pressured by being on TV, that he would lower the sandbag walls. But then the time came, government was nowhere to be seen, so they used knives and other tools themselves to lower the sandbag walls themselves. The government came back, but then they negotiated, and it did lower it a bit. The stale water did go out. So this is the map of where the big bag wall is. The community's right here. widespread support in the community. 78% either joined or supported. Another community where they also, over the Watergate, there's a 2-meter difference between this side and that side. The water was that much lower. So there was a number of reasons for a high number of protests. Widespread perception of government ineptitude, a deep sense of injustice, allegations of corruption, tensions and angers revolving around the country's political conflict. So the red shirts, for example, blamed the yellow, the Democrats, for keeping Bangkok dry. And then also protests have become popular in Thailand over the last 10 years, as I think many of you know, to pursue political goals. I'll skip these conclusions about the protests. I'm happy to answer questions about that. All right, so quickly, what has happened since 2011? So given this explanation, the government, remember, said there was too much water and it's due to climate change. So if this is the explanation, you could basically follow one of two ways, or you can go in between. But so one, you could follow what Netherlands has done, which is removing dikes, which is giving more room for water to go. Sacramento has done this, and this is accept and live with water. Or you could do what you did, and try even harder to block water. And so, despite widespread argument, the government chose option number 2. They proposed a $350 billion baht water management plan, which is about $10 billion US. 90% of it was for the Tapia River Basin. Some projects in the plan were done before the coup. A couple were canceled after mass protests, and some are still planned right now. So this created new uneven vulnerabilities after 2011. So this is what they've done in the Netherlands, is they've relocated the dikes. But that is not what they did in Thailand. So this is one of the major industrial states was flooded. You can see how high this was. So they built major flood walls among the Japanese industrial states. They did not want the Japanese to leave. But people, households outside the state were quite unhappy, and they sued the government actually, saying there could be worse flooding, but the court ruled against them. So these people have to actually use a ladder to climb over to go to lunch, unless they want to go out the main entrance. So the other major project that was done before the coup was they raised a series of roads around Bangkok to act as dikes or flood walls. So they also, this shows the priority. The green area is Bangkok itself, which is the first zone 1. Zone 2 is this area, zone 3, and this area has no priority at all. And so these are all the different roads that were raised. And so I went out right here to meet people and to interview local community leaders. And what you can see how high they raised the road. This is the house right here, and the road is up here. And so so what they did is they wouldn't have to do environmental impact assessment. They did it in different chunks. So they did them, and they built them 5 together. They also had a public hearing, but they only invited people inside the road to the public hearing, not those outside. And so I interviewed the people, the government officials outside from these local they're called tambons, local government units. They say, what can we do? It's already been built. Some people wrote a letter to the coup government. They haven't received any reply. But they're worried that, but the other issue though is even if there is flooding inside, the road blocks water from draining there. So this is the Thailand Environment Research Institute did a study, and they found that this area would be worse affected. Finally, they're building a series of canals along Bangkok. This is going on. I just went to the community leader earlier this year, and they're quite worried because the slum communities, as you saw, encroach upon the houses, encroach upon the canals, and so they'll have to be cleared out and moved if this comes to fruition. So it's supposed to have been built in 18 months. It's only 10% done right now. But this is a coup government policy, and Bangkok government basically has to follow. So due to a number of political economy factors, which I'll skip right now, the land use control is basically still unfeasible. And so flood walls, infrastructure is still the main response. So since 2011, the government has responded mostly by constructing more and higher flood walls. This is the most economically efficient solution. Protects the inner city, protects the industrial states, but is not the most just. Our fairest solution. So they use floods to further promote and empower private capitalist interests. They enacted a first car buyer policy to help the automobile industry after the floods. They sought to protect Bangkok, particularly the inner city, but they've created new spaces of sacrifice. But this is not surprising since there have been no changes in power structures. There has been a coup, but it's still highly unequal power, and it's even more autocratic than before. There haven't been elections for many years, so there's less space for political reform. So those in power still have the greatest access to resources and decide about the use of these resources. So they continue to use land in ways that are most profitable and apportion flood protection infrastructure to areas where they invest. So continually, the poor, unfortunately, will suffer the most. So to conclude, I argue that there are social environmental causes of the 2011 floods. The most powerful groups in Thailand profited from changes to the urban environment. State practices before 2011 contributed to the floods and created uneven vulnerabilities to the floods. But also a high degree of inequality contributed to production of vulnerability and injustice. So research on and solutions to flooding must therefore be social and political, including addressing power structures. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for going a little over.
Danny, we have time for questions. Do I have a taker, Dan?
So I wonder, so Banhan blocks the flooding of his province, right? And the Puatai didn't allow flooding in areas where farmers who voted for the Puatai were. Then Sukhumban doesn't allow Bangkok to be. So you intend this to be an argument for authoritarianism? That when you have democracy and various interests, whether regional or class or whatever, they can block kind of a logical, central, synoptic, rational approach to this kind of thing? Is that what you intend?
So I interviewed the former head of RID, Pramod, and he used to be advisor to the king. And his basic narrative was that the politicians had too much power. They should have left it up to the Royal Irrigation Department, to the water managers, and then because in the past they had succeeded, but it's not. I mean, the question though is, they still have. I mean, so what they would have done probably was devote water. They would have put more water to farmers. And the farmers, though, they didn't get enough compensation though. You interview the farmers, but then the industrial states wouldn't have flooded, and so.
So there's no institutional solution at all? It's just the solutions will be piecemeal and policy oriented?
Well, I would think a more devolved, more decentralized,
Really?
polycentric governance, where you have national and local working together, you have compromises, you say, all right, we flood this area, we'll give you this much compensation, and they agree instead of just pushing the water upon them.
Okay.
But yeah, I think you have to put areas where, for example, so what they have to call in Thailand is gambling, which is monkey cheeks. So retention areas. And so you tell people that this will be a flood zone, but this is a very unpopular political decision because nobody wants to say. But then people will move out so I think there has to be discussions in terms of regional land use planning, and you have to basically put areas aside where they can store water.
If I can just follow up on that question. I mean, you said at the very beginning, and in theory it seems very clear, there are uneven spaces of vulnerability. And basically you made a social injustice kind of argument. And yet the empirical side is much more complicated. I mean, Dan's pointing to the fact that politics play a big role. And so I'm trying to sort of figure out what remains of the social injustice argument. I mean, the other point is very interesting. So you have regions that are protected for political reasons. So Banhan's region, the second rice planting areas that are, red shirt supporters. The center of Bangkok, but then you have the disparities within communities between slum and so on. So, I mean, it seems to me almost there's a different argument for the different sort of levels of analysis. At the regional level, it looks like a big sort of political free-for-all, which, going to Dan's point, doesn't seem to have been getting much better under military rule. So the military also can't seem to solve this problem. And then there's the social inequality that kicks in within areas where, those who are living at a lower level are going to get affected more than those. I mean, is that a correct understanding of what you're arguing, or am I missing something?
I mean, so I guess what you're sort of saying, at the regional level, they haven't been able to address the issues.
Well, at the regional level, it seems to be politics.
Yes.
Because as your big map shows, you could just write Banhan there, no flooding. Then you can say second rice planting areas. Puatai. You can say center of Bangkok, Democrats hold their hands over that area. So that doesn't strike me as a social justice question, because rice farmers aren't that rich. People in Bonhan's province aren't that rich. It's not really a social justice, it's who is your political boss.
Oh yeah.
But at the community level, then you have literally people on uneven ground, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the inequality seeps in.
So I ran out of time, but this is a table I created looking at the different type of injustices. So one is in terms of a spatial injustice. So for example, those communities on the outskirts of Bangkok, I mean, they were flooded much worse. It was 2 meters high on one side, and the other side is basically dry. Or even those that just weren't in Bangkok, just because of the boundary of Bangkok being right here, those on outside Bangkok, and so they suffered much higher losses than those on the other side of these walls. But also in terms of structural protection, so housing estates, as you talked about, if you're wealthier, you can enjoy it. You live on higher land. Slum communities, they suffer there. Or even the airport, they stay dry. Areas that are outside the airport, they didn't have as much infrastructure, and so they were flooded worse. And then also, so for example, I didn't talk about in Bang Buatong, which is the mayor, he gave out aid and he gave more compensation to those who voted for him. So in the market area, they didn't vote for him, so they got the less amount of aid. They were flooded the worst. They didn't get much relief. And so in the industrial states within Bangkok itself, there's 2 industrial states, they were protected at all costs. So I was trying to put it, so I mean, it's distribution in all these senses. And I talked about the 3 types of environmental injustices, but also it's procedural in this case. They didn't consult anybody whether they're going to put up the sandbag walls where they did. And then groups outside the outskirts are recognized less. So for example, one government official told me you have to cut off the hands to protect the heart. So I mean, I think as I talked about from cost-benefit analysis, it can make sense, but from a socially just perspective, it's not. There are definitely problems.
Stefan?
I had a question. You mentioned a number of communities at the beginning that you compared or at least studied. Are there similarities and differences in the way they, especially differences in the way they were affected by the flood and how they dealt with it? And maybe there are lessons from one of the communities for the other communities that could be drawn.
It's a good question. So I went to Yu Charon, which was one of the ones where the leader Tinakon was even in the Bangkok Post. He was in Thai newspapers as well as a successful community leader, and they set up this scheme where they were together. They reduced the amount of flooding by having a group that manned the flood walls. But in the end, they got flooded because they had to buy sandbag walls. But in terms of evacuation, they did a very good job in terms of coordinating, helping the elderly, helping children. But right next to them, there's this other community, Srigan, and the community leader fled. He evacuated the first instance. And they were flooded instantly, and they seemed to be affected worse by the floods. So there was differences in terms of community leaders. I mean, not necessarily in these communities. I mean, I compared Yucharon and Prom Samrit because one was a lower middle income, and the other was a middle income. And I found that Prom Samrit was flooded worse. They were affected worse by the floods. And the water was higher. It stayed longer because of the location close to the canals. So that's one thing I looked at. But also, I looked at this one because they're outside Bangkok. So looking at the differences. I tried to look at communities right on the border areas where there was conflicts. And so that's one, because if at first I was going to pick only a dry community, but that wouldn't have been very helpful. But also looking at urbanization, so there's rapid land use change in all these communities. All these communities have been flooded for the first time, and that was also one reason why they didn't evacuate, because they didn't believe it never flooded this badly in their lifetimes.
I don't know to what extent this is related, but I know that there is the development now to create a promenade halfway across the Tapia in the central area, until where, I don't know, how can be this related, do you think, because I heard that there is a lot of social injustice there actually pushing away people, and if this thing is going been going on for years, I think, but now I think they're really starting. I don't know. What do you think about that, and to what extent can be related? Because it's still.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I read about it in the newspaper. I haven't studied about it, but it seems that there's a lot of communities that live along that area, more slum communities, and they would be evicted.
Exactly, yes.
And so I think it's the same questions of, are they recognized? Are they part of the decision-making process? And you saw that with the fort, the Mahagnakan fort recently as well, where these communities got evicted. In terms of flooding, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
In terms of the risk of that. I mean, it seems that in general, though, that part of Bangkok is quite protected by this point. I mean, because they basically made the decision to protect the inner areas at all costs. But I think it's a more question of justice in terms of these communities being evicted just to build a promenade, and also not doing an EIA.
I landed for the very first time in Bangkok. 10 days. I was not even sure I was able to. And I passed nearby. It was November 2011. I passed next to the Tapia. Was by madness, but still, yeah, they tend to protect this area. Other areas nearby completely.
No, I mean, I think in 2011, yes, that part would be. But I think now what they've done, they've created infrastructure upstream.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I was very interested in your argument saying that how the government or the elites, I mean, they have the more access to resources to make decisions. But I want to know, what about in the financial aspect? I mean, you mentioned this cost-effective solution that was not necessarily social justice. So, is there any like a hierarchy or institutional power that may affect in some way how the power of these elites in Thailand? I don't know if you understand my question.
Almost. So, what do you mean by institutional?
Yeah, if there is you mentioned this global governance aspect. So I would like to know how, I mean, besides the fact that the elites might have power, I was wondering if they really have sort of power, or there is a supranational power that may affect how they take the decisions within the country.
I'm not sure what you mean entirely. I'll try to take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So so when you think about elites, you think about the elite, particularly in the inner city of Bangkok. Those are the ones. So but you have these new elites, like I talked about with Bonharn, and that's what there's inter-elite conflict here. The other major piece is the monarchy. They protected the palace at all costs, the prince's palace, which was across. So the areas north of that area were flooded the worst. But I think now if you look at Thailand's structure, it's very elite-driven because there's no elections, there's no accountability. The coup government has been about.
Yeah, just on that point, I mean, when you mentioned about how they build all these dams and canals, they may rely on borrowing from the World Bank or
so supranational, no. So Thaksin, he stopped borrowing from the World Bank 10 plus years ago. So there's not really a lot of supranational. I mean, the Japanese investors were one factor. I mean, because you had the airport seizure before, then you had the red shirt protests. So they're really worried about investors fleeing, and so that was one reason to build the huge flood walls. And the government funded the flood walls, and so that was a pressure upon them. But in terms of UN, or anything.
While we're waiting to see if anybody else wants to say anything, I'm just curious whether you've ever thought about Hong Kong as a comparison. I mean, some people here might know the situation better, but Hong Kong seems to have sorted its flooding problems. And Hong Kong does not seem to have a Dutch-like, let's just let the water flow thing. It's sort of a big blockage strategy, so that's bad from your analysis. And it's also a highly unequal society. So am I missing something, or is Hong Kong really solved this problem through infrastructure, just massive investment in infrastructure? I mean, can this problem be fixed if you just have enough money and throw money at it?
I mean, Tokyo is interesting because Tokyo is less unequal, but they built these huge tunnels. But now, the New York Times just had an article recently how Tokyo is worried about even more flooding. So they have to build more infrastructure. So I guess if it can work if you're very competent. It's part about competency here too, in terms of blocking water. But I think the worry is that you have to keep on building it if there's going to be more and more water, which is the threat of climate change. You think you see more extremes, but it's a good question. I don't know enough about Hong Kong to be able to answer that. So I'm interested in comparing Tokyo, for example.
Question. In your analysis, your ethnographic work, your interviews, we hear a lot of voices from low socioeconomic people, but you bring in a lot of the elite. So that, I mean, the voices do support your social injustice theory, but did you interview anybody from the more elites? To kind of
I didn't go to elite communities, but I did interview, for example, a very wealthy ex-deputy prime minister. I interviewed an ex-prime minister who's also elite, and so. So the ex-deputy prime minister said there was too much water, for example. That's what he said. But I mean, but the common narrative I heard from these people also was that you have to protect the heart and you might have to cut off the hands.
Oh, that's right. You said that earlier.
And so it's all about the inner city. It's all about.
So they really believe
these people have to bear sacrifices.
I see. Okay, yeah.
That was their narrative, and so what's best for them is also best for the country.
Given that you mentioned the concept of gambling, to my knowledge, it's founded by the late King Bhumibol, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about what was the king's position in terms of like flooding, knowing that he funded these dam projects, which are named after him and his royal family. The reluctance to change strategies, would you find it feasible to think that politicians are reluctant to change strategies because of the king's decision in such ways to to manage the water?
Yeah, there's a good article written about this actually. So I interviewed a member of parliament, and he said whenever the king put his weight behind a project, would basically go ahead. Nobody could oppose those projects. So some of those dams, the major dams. But in terms of Bangkok, he actually said, "Let the water flow." A lot of people I interviewed like to quote the king, and they said he said, "Let water flow." But at the same time, he also supported all these major infrastructure projects. So there's a little bit of contradiction there. So I mean, it seems that people use the king's word for their own interest often. I don't know with the new king if he's going to have a water management strategy.
A few other things on his plate.
Two quick questions. Number one, just the reverse of your observations. Is there any badly flooded areas that are quite well off, which is really the reverse case? And have you noticed any of these areas, and what kind of if they are, what kind of takeaways there is? The second question relates to Dan's earlier point, is that now that we have the military government in power, which is essentially highly autocratic, should we expect what you see in this whole upstream diversion, local politics leading to injustice thingy being arbitrated, which is a net benefit? Or should we expect the military government becoming highly similar to what was it had always been, i.e. they start installing their own people and benefiting their own selectorates or whatever you want to call them? So net, I mean, should we expect, how should we expect the trajectory to change now that the military is in power?
Okay, good point. So for the first one, there's an upper middle class area named Pakret. It's right here. Actually, I can show on this map. It's in Nantaburi, right around the bend, right here. Maybe it's down, no, sorry, it's right down here. So this area was not flooded. It was known, like the government even the municipal government even has a brochure calling the Pakret model, because everywhere around them they were almost like an island. So what they did is they built a huge dike, a sandbag wall along the river. They also prepared in advance. The mayor was assuming it would be badly flooded, and they negotiated with communities outside the flood walls to give them to bear the flooding, and also they gave them relief. But also they negotiated, because of Don Mueang right here, they wanted to break down the sandbag wall so Pakret would get flooded, and they also negotiated with them as well. But in some ways it's successful. The other thing is, because the other area was less protected, they just basically pushed the water downstream or to the other side. But it is an isolated case of, I mean, I guess in some ways it's good local governance. But as for your second question about the military, so I talked about the 350 billion baht scheme, and the Prayut government basically canceled it. Because, so for example, a lot of the projects would go to one of Thaksin's cronies, it's a Korean company named K-Water. And so most of it is still intact. They just changed the different agencies. So before, Plat Prasop, the deputy prime minister under Yingluck, he was in charge and said they made the head of the Irrigation department in charge of the project. But it's still very heavy infrastructure. And I mean, so you haven't seen major flooding in Bangkok since then, but you can see it in other parts of Thailand. And there's still these interagency clashes, still problems of prediction, of evacuation. And so it doesn't seem like governance has gotten a lot better since then. And it's very highly autocratic. It's slow moving also, because it relies a lot on very top down. It's not local decision making. And so that's part of the problem with the military government.
So it's crony replacing crony, essentially.
Yes. So yeah, for the flood walls itself, they're also very crony driven, because they hire the local construction companies, which are their friends. Yeah.
So if there are no further questions, then all that remains is to thank you for this very interesting talk.